Marilyn Monroe was by the time she married Arthur Miller in 1956, and more importantly, you have to understand what she needed from him. Marilyn Monroe was not just a movie star, she was a phenomenon. She was Some Like It Hot. She was Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. She was the woman who sang Happy Birthday to a president in a dress so tight she had to be sewn into it. She was everywhere, always, a constant explosion of light and beauty and chaos. But behind all of that, and this is the part that most people still don't fully grasp, was a woman drowning in insecurity so deep it was almost incomprehensible. She had grown up in foster homes. She had been passed around, ignored, used. She had clawed her way to the top of Hollywood through sheer force of desire and talent, but the industry had never let her forget what it thought of her. She was the dumb blonde, the body without a brain, the joke that everyone was laughing at, even when they were applauding. She knew it, she felt it every single day, and it ate at her. By the mid-1950s, Marilyn was trying desperately to be taken seriously. She had moved to New York, she had enrolled at the Actors Studio, she was studying method acting under Lee Strasberg. She was reading books, attending lectures, surrounding herself with intellectuals. She was fighting, with everything she had, to be seen as something more than a pair of legs in a sequined dress. And then she met Arthur Miller. Arthur Miller was the most respected playwright in America. He had written Death of a Salesman. He had written The Crucible. He was brilliant, cerebral, serious, everything that Hollywood had told Marilyn she was not and could never be. When Miller fell for her, when this towering giant of American literature looked at Marilyn Monroe and said, "I love you," it was the greatest validation she had ever received. It was proof that she was more, proof that she mattered in a way that went beyond her face, beyond her body, beyond the box office. She married him with her whole heart. She believed in them completely. She called it the greatest thing that had ever happened to her. She told friends this was finally it. She had found her person, her home, her safe place in the world. That belief is what made what happened next so catastrophic. The cracks appeared early, though neither of them wanted to admit it. Miller was a writer. Writers need solitude, silence, distance. They need to observe the world rather than live loudly inside it. Marilyn was the opposite. She was noise and energy in need, a woman who required constant reassurance, who could call people at 3 a.m. just because the dark felt too heavy, who struggled with sleep, with pills, with the relentless machinery of her own mind. She was not easy to be with. No one who is that brilliant and that damaged ever is. But what complicated things further was the professional dimension. Almost immediately after their marriage, Miller began working on a screenplay specifically for Marilyn. It was called The Misfits. He wrote it as a gift, a serious, dramatic role that would finally prove to the world what Marilyn Monroe was capable of as an actress. On the surface, it was an act of love. He was giving her what she had always wanted, but the process of creating it, and what it revealed about how he saw her, would tear them apart. During the filming of The Misfits in 1960, on location in the Nevada desert, things got very bad very fast. Marilyn was in physical and emotional collapse. She was heavily dependent on sleeping pills and sedatives. She was late to set constantly. She couldn't remember her lines. She was hospitalized mid-production. The cast and crew were exhausted. Clark Gable, her co-star, was furious. The director, John Huston, was barely holding it together, and Arthur Miller, her husband, the man who was supposed to be her anchor, was watching all of it and writing it down. He was keeping a diary, or more accurately, working on notes that would later become his memoir. And in those notes, in that diary, he was recording his real thoughts about his wife, the woman he had married, the woman he had written an entire film to honor. And what he wrote was not kind. The exact circumstances of how Marilyn found the diary have been pieced together from multiple sources over the decades, from biographers, from friends she confided in, from her own fractured accounts. The picture that emerges is both simple and devastating. She was alone. Miller had stepped away. And Marilyn, in the restless way that anxious people explore the spaces around them, came across the diary. She opened it, and somewhere in those pages, she found a passage in which Miller described her not as his beloved wife, not as the extraordinary woman he had celebrated to the world, but as a disappointment, a burden, a source of embarrassment. Different sources describe the passage differently. Some say he wrote that he had looked at her and felt only disappointment, where once he had felt love. Some say he wrote that she had let him down, that he had expected more from her, that living with her was not what he had imagined. Some accounts suggest he expressed a kind of tired despair about her, a sense that she was broken in ways he had not anticipated and could not fix. But here is the detail that cuts the deepest, the one that appears most consistently across accounts. Miller wrote something to the effect that he had hoped she would be different, that she was not the woman he had believed her to be, that the reality of Marilyn Monroe, up close in private, without the cameras, had in some way failed the idea of her. Think about what that means to a woman like Marilyn. Think about what that means to someone who had spent her entire life being told she was not enough, who had married this man, this brilliant and serious man, partly because he had made her feel like she was enough, like she was real, like she was worthy of being truly known and truly loved. And now here was the truth in his own handwriting. He had looked at her, the real her, not the performance, and found her wanting. She was shattered. People who saw Marilyn in the immediate aftermath described a woman who had gone somewhere unreachable. She did not scream. She did not throw things. She became very quiet, which for Marilyn was the most frightening sign of all. She withdrew. She went cold in a way that those close to her said they had never seen before. She confronted Miller. Accounts differ on how that conversation went, but what is consistent is that it went badly. There was no recovery. There was no tender moment where he explained it away, or she forgave him, and they moved forward. The damage was done. The thing she feared most, that the love was a performance, that she had been weighed and measured in private and found lacking, had been confirmed in his own words. Here is where the story becomes more complicated, because Arthur Miller was not simply a villain in this narrative. He was a human being in an impossible situation, and the diary, whatever it actually said, was the product of that impossibility. Miller had married a myth. He had fallen for Marilyn Monroe, the idea, the luminous creature he saw across a crowded room. But what he got, what he woke up to every morning, was a woman in profound psychological pain, a woman whose childhood trauma had left her fundamentally unable to trust that love was permanent, or real, or deserved. A woman who needed a level of emotional care and management that would have taxed a saint. A woman whose professional demands and personal crises made ordinary domestic life nearly impossible. And Miller was a man who needed to write. He needed to process. He needed to take the chaotic raw material of his life and shape it into language, because that was how he made sense of the world. The diary was not written to hurt her. It was written because he was drowning too, and writing was the only way he knew how to keep his head above water. But intent does not equal impact. The fact that he was suffering does not change what she read. And what she read told her something that would poison the rest of her life. That even Arthur Miller, who loved her, who chose her, who built something for her, ultimately saw her the way everyone else did. As too much. As not enough. As a problem to be endured. Several biographers have noted that the publication of Miller's memoir Time Bends in 1987, long after Marilyn's death, confirmed much of what those who knew her had suspected. In the memoir, Miller writes about the marriage with a kind of rueful distance that is not cruel, but is certainly not warm. He describes her limitations. He describes his exhaustion. He describes, between the lines, if not always directly, a man who had come to see the woman he married as someone he could not save and could barely survive alongside. It is honest, you can give him that. But honesty delivered in private, to a diary, to a memoir published 25 years after her death, is a different thing entirely from being the woman who found that honesty before it was meant to be found, before she was supposed to know, before she had any defenses ready. After the discovery of the diary, Marilyn Monroe began the final chapter of her life. And it is not a gentle chapter. The Misfits wrapped production in November 1960. By January 1961, Marilyn had filed for divorce from Arthur Miller. The split was announced to the world as mutual and amicable. It was neither. Friends who were with Marilyn during this period describe a woman who had lost something essential. Not just a husband, not just a marriage, something more fundamental. The belief that she was capable of being loved properly, completely without reservation. She had gambled everything on Arthur Miller representing something different from every other man who had used or dismissed or discarded her. And the diary had told her, in his own hand, that she had lost that bet. She began seeing her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, with increasing frequency. She was dependent on barbiturates in a way that was becoming genuinely life-threatening. She was hospitalized in February 1961 at the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic, under circumstances that still spark debate. Some accounts suggest she went voluntarily, others that she was essentially committed without fully understanding what was happening. Either way, she hated it. She begged to be let out. She felt imprisoned. She called Joe DiMaggio, her ex-husband, and it was DiMaggio, not Miller, not her psychiatrist, not her business managers who came and got her out. Think about that. The man she had divorced 7 years earlier was the one who came when she called, and Miller, the husband who had just finalized their divorce, was nowhere. The period between the divorce and her death in August 1962 is one of the most analyzed stretches of time in Hollywood history. She made one more film, Something's Got to Give, which was never completed. She was fired from the production in June 1962, though some accounts suggest the firing was more complex than the studio's public statements acknowledged. She had her famous encounter with President Kennedy, and possibly with Robert Kennedy, though the full truth of those relationships remains a subject of intense debate and speculation. She was not well. Anyone who has looked at photographs of Marilyn Monroe in the final year of her life can see it. There is something gone from her eyes that was there before, a light that had been switched off at some fundamental level. And those who knew her traced that dimming, at least in part, to the moment she stood in a room in Nevada and read what her husband really thought of her. Here is where this story stops being just a tragedy and starts being something more complicated and more troubling. Marilyn Monroe died on August 4, 1962. She was 36 years old. The official cause of death was acute barbiturate poisoning, ruled a probable suicide, and for decades that was largely where the public conversation ended. A sad ending for a sad life. A brilliant and broken woman who could not survive the machinery of her own fame. But over time, as documents were declassified, as witnesses aged and began to talk, as biographers dug deeper, a more complex picture emerged. Not necessarily a conspiracy, though some have gone there, but a deliberate suppression of information about who Marilyn was in her final years, who she was connected to, and what she knew. Her connections to the Kennedy family, to Jack, to Bobby, and possibly to their inner circle, meant that there were powerful people who had very strong reasons to keep certain details about Marilyn Monroe's life and death quiet. The FBI had a file on her. J. Edgar Hoover, who collected leverage on powerful people the way other men collected stamps, was aware of her. The CIA had interests in the Kennedy family that intersected in ways that have never been fully untangled. None of that necessarily changes the story of the diary. But it does explain why Marilyn Monroe's private life, her real inner life, her documented pain, the accounts of people who were actually with her, was for so long filtered through a lens designed to minimize and simplify. She was easier to manage as a symbol than as a person, easier to understand as a tragedy than as a woman with specific, grievable wounds. The diary story Miller, watching his wife disintegrate and writing about it with a scholar's detachment, was one of those specific wounds. And like so much about Marilyn's real experience, it got buried under the mythology. There is a version of this story that focuses on Arthur Miller as the villain, the cold intellectual who married a goddess, and then, when the goddess turned out to be a woman with needs and nightmares, wrote about his disappointment in his diary. That version is emotionally satisfying. It gives us someone to blame, but the more honest version is harder and sadder than that. What was lost in that marriage, what Marilyn found in that diary, was not just Arthur Miller's love. It was her last real hope that she could be known and still be loved, that the truth of her, the full complicated human truth, was not too much for someone to bear. She had been performing her whole life, performing happiness, performing confidence, performing the role of Marilyn Monroe, even when she was terrified and exhausted and barely hanging on. Miller had seemed like the one person in front of whom she did not have to perform. He was supposed to be the person who saw behind the curtain and stayed anyway. The diary told her he had seen behind the curtain, and that it had been too much for him. People who study trauma talk about what happens when our deepest fear about ourselves is confirmed by someone we trust. When the thing we have always suspected, that we are unlovable, that we are too broken, that we are fundamentally too much, is reflected back to us by a person whose love was supposed to disprove it. What happens is not simple sadness. What happens is a kind of structural collapse, like a building that loses its load-bearing wall. Everything that was being held up by that belief comes down. For Marilyn Monroe, Arthur Miller's diary was that structural collapse, and she never fully rebuilt. For years, the full details of what Marilyn found in that diary were kept deliberately vague. Miller himself, when asked about it, was evasive. He did not deny the incident. He did not confirm the specific contents. He was a man who dealt in words, and he chose his words very carefully when it came to this. His memoir, Time Bends, published in 1987, touched on the marriage but handled it with the careful hand of a man who knows he is still being watched. He was not brutal about Marilyn. He was in many ways kind, but the kindness had the quality of retrospective guilt rather than genuine understanding. and readers who knew the full story of the marriage could feel the gaps in what he chose to say. After Miller's death in 2005, the scholarly and biographical work around both him and Marilyn intensified. Estate records, letters, and personal documents began to be examined with greater freedom. Biographers who had spent careers piecing together the Marilyn Monroe puzzle, from Donald Spoto's landmark 1993 biography to more recent works, continued to find new threads. What has emerged, particularly in the last decade, is a much richer understanding of just how much Marilyn knew about what Miller thought of her and how long she carried that knowledge. It was not just the diary. There were conversations. There were moments on the set of The Misfits that witnesses described as icily cold, as if something fundamental had already broken between them before the cameras started rolling each morning. Some researchers now believe that Marilyn had known or suspected the full truth of Miller's private feelings for some time before she found the diary, and that the diary was not a revelation so much as a confirmation, the moment she could no longer pretend she didn't know. That distinction matters, because it means she had been carrying the weight of that suspicion, performing love and hope and faith in the marriage, while part of her already knew it wasn't real. That is an almost unbearable thing to live with, and it helps explain the severity of her reaction when she found the written proof. Why does this matter now? Why are we talking about a diary, a marriage, a moment of private devastation that happened more than 60 years ago? Because Marilyn Monroe is not just a historical figure, she is one of the most enduring cultural symbols in the world. Her face is on posters in dorm rooms and galleries and T-shirts across every continent. People who were born decades after her death feel a connection to her that is almost impossible to explain rationally. And part of the reason for that connection, part of why she still reaches through time and grabs people by the throat, is because her pain was real, and people recognize real pain even when it is dressed up in diamonds and platinum hair. The story of Arthur Miller's diary matters because it is one of the clearest, most human moments in the Marilyn Monroe story. It strips away the mythology. It takes away the movie screen and the cameras and the studio lighting and the carefully constructed public persona. And what it leaves is just a woman standing in a room reading something that hurt her more than anything else ever had. There is also something urgent in this story that speaks to our present moment. We are in an era of extraordinary public scrutiny, where public figures, particularly women, are simultaneously deified and destroyed, where the gap between the public performance and the private reality is more policed and more exploited than ever. Marilyn Monroe lived that reality at an extreme that most people cannot imagine. And what finally broke her was not the studio executives or the paparazzi or the public or even the men who used her. What broke her was the private judgment of the one person she had trusted with her private self. That is a story that resonates. That will always resonate. In the last several years, the conversation around Marilyn Monroe's life and death has shifted significantly among serious historians and cultural scholars. There is a growing consensus that the early narrative, fragile blonde destroyed by fame, was not just incomplete but actively misleading, shaped in part by people who had reasons to keep certain truths buried. The diary incident has become a focal point for many of these scholars, precisely because it illustrates the disconnect between Miller's public persona, the supportive, brilliant husband, and the private reality that Marilyn was experiencing. Several scholars have pointed out that Miller's later work, including the essays he wrote about Marilyn after her death, has a quality of managed grief that carefully avoids the hardest questions about his own role in her deterioration. There are also growing conversations about the medical and psychological dimension of Marilyn's final years. The level of sedative medication she was on, prescribed, managed, and in some ways enabled by the people around her, is now understood to have been genuinely dangerous, and questions about who knew what and when have become part of a broader reckoning with how Hollywood treated the mental health of its stars. Some researchers have gone further, arguing that the documentation of Marilyn's private thoughts and feelings, her letters, her diary fragments, her therapy notes, paints a picture of a woman who was far more self-aware than she was given credit for, who understood with painful clarity the dynamics of what was happening to her, who was not simply a passive victim of circumstances, but a person actively fighting, with inadequate tools, against forces that were too big for her. The diary is part of that picture. She knew what she found, she knew what it meant, and she kept going anyway, for another 2 years, with that knowledge inside her. That is not weakness. That is the opposite of weakness. Despite everything that has been uncovered, there are still significant gaps in the record. There are still things we do not know, and may never know, about what Arthur Miller actually wrote, about what exactly Marilyn read, and about the full scope of what it did to her. The diary itself, the physical object, has never been publicly produced or confirmed to exist as a standalone document. Miller's notes and papers, as far as scholars have been able to determine, were incorporated into his memoir and other published work, rather than preserved separately. Which means we are working, as historians often must, from accounts and recollections and secondary sources rather than from the primary document itself. This has led some skeptics to question whether the incident happened exactly as described or whether the specifics have been sharpened and dramatized in the telling. That is a fair question. Memory is not a tape recorder. People who told stories about Marilyn, particularly after her death, had complicated motives: grief, guilt, self-promotion, the desire to be at the center of a legendary story. But what cannot be questioned is the outcome. What cannot be questioned is that something happened between Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller, during or around the production of The Misfits, that permanently altered the texture of their relationship and the trajectory of her emotional life. The divorce, the collapse, the specific way people describe her in the months and years that followed, all of that is documented, all of that is real, and the diary, whatever it contained, however precisely or imprecisely any given account captures its actual words, stands as the most human and most devastating explanation for why. If there is one thing that the diary story does, the thing it does more powerfully than perhaps any other episode in the Marilyn Monroe saga, it is this: it makes her fully human, not the dumb blonde, not the tragic sex symbol, not the cautionary tale about fame, or the cautionary tale about pills, or the endless speculation about whether she was murdered or whether she was in love with a president, or whether she was a genius or a victim or a manipulator or a saint. Just a woman who fell in love with a man she trusted, who opened his diary, who read one line, and who was never quite the same afterward. We have all been in a version of that room. Maybe not literally, maybe not with those stakes. But most of us know what it is to discover that someone we love has a private opinion of us that is different from the face they show us. Most of us know the specific horror of being seen, really seen, and finding out that what was seen was found lacking. Marilyn Monroe knew that horror at the most extreme possible level. She knew it publicly, constantly, from the industry and the press and the audience. And she knew it privately, in the room from the man she had trusted most. She kept getting up anyway, she kept performing, she kept trying, right up until the night she didn't. That is who she was, not the symbol, not the icon. The woman who kept getting up. Arthur Miller's diary did not kill Marilyn Monroe. It is too simple and too convenient to say that it did. What it did was confirm a story she had been fighting against her entire life. The story that she was too broken to be truly loved. And once that story is confirmed, in writing, by the person you love most, fighting against it becomes nearly impossible. She fought anyway. For 2 more years she fought. This story is still unfolding. As Miller's archives continue to be examined, as new biographies are written, as the cultural conversation around Marilyn Monroe continues to deepen and mature, more details will emerge. More of the private truth will come into the light. What we know today is enough to understand the shape of what happened. A brilliant, vulnerable woman, a brilliant, complicated man, a marriage built on the hope that love could be the thing that finally made her safe. A diary that told her it could not. History has not been entirely fair to Marilyn Monroe. It has made her an object when she was a subject. It has made her a punchline when she was a person. It has talked about her endlessly without, for a very long time, actually listening to what she was saying about her own experience. She was saying, in every interview, in every poem she wrote, in every letter, in the way she fell apart and put herself back together over and over and over again, I am here, I am real, I am more than what you see. Arthur Miller's diary told her that even to him, even to the man who loved her, she had not fully managed to make that case. She died 14 months after their divorce was finalized. She was 36 years old. And the world she left behind has been trying to understand her ever since. Maybe this is what understanding her looks like. Not the mythology, not the dress, not the president, not the platinum hair, just the room, the diary, and the one line she was never supposed to read. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, because as the archives open and the truth comes into sharper focus, this story is far from over, and you do not want to miss what comes next.